Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the history of India from 1750s to 1857, today we will talk about the indigenous and colonial education. As all of us are aware that how education is an important concern all the time, and because of the education there is a lot of scope in terms of the development of a society, and the individuals, they can also become mobile in terms of attaining the education. Education in a way will also provide the kind of atmosphere where the kind of superstitions which are there in the society, the backwardness which is there in the society, it will also vanish. So the indigenous education and the colonial education in the context of the colonial period, when we tend to understand it, then we will find that how the British they introduced English education in India. And before that, the kind of education system which was there in India was related to the religious learning and various other kinds of learning. So British, they wanted to supplant that kind of learning so that they are able to introduce English education, and when they will introduce English education, then the natives they will feel more comfortable in terms of having some kind of a consonance with British ideas, and at the same time Indians, they could be used in the lower administrative positions in the administration. So that way they will be able to get the educated Indians, those who will be able to support or assist the British in terms of carrying out their functions, day-to-day activities. So if we see the introduction of the colonial education, that was the basic thrust of the colonial government in terms of introducing that kind of education. If you want to see the references, then Suresh Chandra Ghosh, as you can see on the screen, these are the references which you can see. Education policy in India since Warren Hastings, then Thomas Metcalfe's Ideologies of the Raj, Macaulay's Minute on Education, then Lakshmi Subramaniam's History of India, and Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's From Palasi to Partition, A History of Modern India, and NCERT and IGNOU material. So these are some of the readings which you can refer when you want to read about the indigenous as well as the colonial education. And when one is trying to understand the kind of idea which British had in terms of having that kind of an education in India, then we find that India had a very widespread system of education, and it was available to many people at different points of time, beginning from the Vedic period, and even in the 18th century we find that this kind of a learning which was there in the society existed. And education definitely helps in the transformation of the society, and it in a way was also reflective during the times when British came to India. So indigenous education was in a way not as British or the Europeans, they claimed that the education system in India was not suitable at that point of time, and how the British came and they introduced the Western education which was rational in nature, and because of the British ideas and educations, Indians, they could improve and develop themselves. So but when we tend to understand the indigenous education, we will find that, as Suresh Chandra Ghosh, he has argued that it was not a centralized or homogeneous apparatus of education, and the system of education had pathshalas and maktabs where gurus and maulvis, they were teaching in vernacular, and the provisions of domestic instruction for the rich was also there. Girls, they were not taught in the formal education system in the 18th century due to the social prejudices and superstitions which were there in the society. So we find that the kind of problems which came in the society in terms of education were also a result of the medieval practices, and how during the medieval and the Mughal period there was not much thrust on the education of women. And when we talk about the Western education, then we will find that how the people, those who were associated initially with education in the context of the Western education, were the missionaries, and but the kind of efforts which were there in terms of propagating education in India, so the people, they had this kind of a desire that how Christianity could be spread among the natives of India. So we find that the efforts of the British government or the missionaries initially were they had this kind of a desire that how Christianity can be spread among the Indians, and when Christianity will be spread in India, then they will come closer to the ideas of the British. And we find that in terms of education, they introduced that kind of a curriculum which was related to the reading, writing and arithmetic, and the focus was on the Christian teachings. So that was the kind of idea which the British had initially, and thereafter we see that how Governor General Warren Hastings he established Calcutta Madrasa for the cultivation of Arabic and Persian studies, and he also started the Banaras Sanskrit College to promote the classical studies in Sanskrit. Aparna Basu she has argued that the motive of establishing these institutions was to train the Indian assistants to English judges in order to explain principles of Hindu and Muslim laws. So we find that how these kind of institutions which were established, they were there so that the assistants they could be trained so that they are able to assist the English judges. So that was the kind of idea, but on the other hand we find that Orientalists, as Warren Hastings is considered to be, how the Asiatic Society of Bengal, it was established, and some scholars they have expressed the opinion that how these people they had genuine love for the Oriental learning, and they in a way gave a kind of thrust to the Oriental learning, and that is why such kind of society and institutions they were being established. On the other hand, we find certain people, those who believed that European literature and science that was the most important thing in the context of any kind of society, and Charles Grant was one person who talked about the dismal image of the Indian society, and how Indian society was in a way engaged in superstition, idolatry and immorality. So this is the kind of idea which Charles Grant had, and in his tract or treatise which he wrote, which was the Observations on the State of Society among the Asian Subjects of Great Britain, he talks about these kind of evils which are there in the Indian society. So people like Charles Grant, they were critical of the Indian society at all levels, and they communicated that how Indian society was having these kind of evils, and at the same time they considered that if Western education will be introduced in the Indian society, then all sorts of problems of the Indian society they will vanish. So the introduction of Christianity was very important to these people, and how these people at the same time got engaged in the British system of politics at that point of time, and how they also got official positions at different points of time, and because of which they were able to influence the different kinds of policies which were followed in India. So we basically find that Grant he talks about that how Hindus they were dishonest, how they were corrupt, they were fraud, how mutual hatred and distrust was prevalent among them, and their customs were considered to be barbarous in nature. And he also communicates that Muslims they were haughty, and they had a lot of licentiousness, and a lot of lawlessness it prevailed among them. And Grant believed that both these communities they had these kinds of problems, and when both of them they came together that way, how they interacted with each other, so their problems they multiplied. So Grant is basically showing the kind of prejudice which he had towards the Indian society, and he in a way talks about that how the introduction of Christianity will bring this kind of a situation, that all the evils they will vanish. And at the same time the position of people like Grant were also closer to the free merchants position, and free merchants, they believed that more and more British goods they should enter the Indian markets, and when they will enter the Indian markets, then definitely Indians they will be able to purchase them because they will be cheap. So they did not want that any kind of monopoly which East India Company was given by the British government should exist. And if we see that in the long run, if Indians they will be closer to the British, then they will have some kind of allegiance towards them, and the needs of the industrial revolution and the evangelical movement they also dictated this kind of a policy. Industrial revolution in Britain, it needed that the raw materials from India they should be sent to for the British industries, and British industries they needed all sorts of raw materials, and when these raw materials they were being sent from India to Britain, then definitely their industries they prospered. And at the same time, evangelicals they had this kind of an idea that how they had to spread Christianity, and people those who were allowed to come to India after 1813, and the missionaries those who were established in Sirampur and later in other regions as well. They wanted to spread the ideals of the Christianity, and they wanted to project that Christianity was a better religion than other religions. And we find that the objective of the British in this context was to expand their trade, and they felt that if they will have this kind of a educational system, then the economic and political consolidation of the Indian empire will be complete. So basically we find that if they had to fight the barbarism of the Indians, then the civilizing mission of the British it will be helpful for the Indians. And there were other Indian reformers like Raja Ram Mohun Roy, and if you see that how the ideals which were talked about by the British, how James Mill he talks about the Indian society as some sort of a static and stagnant society, and he communicates that key to progress was the Western science and knowledge. And reformers like Raja Ram Mohun Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, they also started a number of schools, and Raja Ram Mohun Roy felt that how Western education definitely will help the Indians. And when such kind of schools etc. they were being established in India by Raja Ram Mohun Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and other people those who were associated with education, it made a lot of contribution in that context. And we also find that Raja Ram Mohun Roy was also supportive of women's education, and he in a way suggested that how with the coming of the Western education, the problems or evils which are there in the society, as he also spearheaded the movement of Sati, and he was against any kind of idolatry. So he wanted to reform the Indian religion that way, Hinduism, but at the same time he did not consider that Christianity was a superior religion in any way. He was also critical of the miracles and superstitions which were there in Christianity, and he held that Hindu religion was totally suitable in that context, and whatever evils or ill practices which had entered into the religion over a period of time, the reformers, if they will come together and if they will be able to communicate to the masses, then those evils will be done away with over a period of time. So we find that missionaries, they were more concerned with the religious education, and they wanted to convert Indians to Christianity. and we find that the missionaries, basically they were being allowed to India, especially after 1813, the Charter Act which comes, and thereafter we also find that a sum of rupees 1 lakh was stipulated in the Charter Act of 1813, that money had to be in a way spent by the East India Company on education in India. But we find that annually that kind of a money was to be spent, but East India Company did not take any such measure, and no money was spent by the East India Company from 1813 onwards as well. So we find that there was a lot of some kind of a problem during this period with regard to the difference of opinion between the Orientalist and the Anglicist. And Orientalist, they believed that how Oriental education in the vernacular should be provided to the Indians, because they felt that Indian society was not in any way inferior to the Western society. So the Indian society had some kind of cultural differences when you compare it with the Anglicist society or the European society. On the other hand, Anglicists, they believed that the entire amount should be spent on the English education by the British. So in a way we find that Orientalists basically were trying to promote the Oriental learning in terms of Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and on the other hand the Anglicists, they wanted to emphasize only on the English education. So if we see it in the framework that how in a way the potential of the mother tongue as a medium of education was neglected due to this, and it definitely created that kind of an impact which can be realized even today, the way the English education was in a way introduced in India. And many scholars like Raja Ram Mohun Roy, he believed that when you will introduce the Western education, then definitely the society will also feel that kind of a change. If you see in the framework of the institutions, then the Committee of Public Instruction in 1823 was set up to give a shape to the new educational policy of the government and initiate steps for its implementation. So the aim of the company was to give some kind of a thrust to the educational policy and how this educational policy can be implemented. If we see the kind of principles with which this committee was guided, we will find that it in a way to win the confidence of the educated and the influential classes by encouraging learning and literature they respected. Secondly, use the limited funds that were available for promoting higher education of upper classes with thrust being on appeasement. So these were the two principles, as you can see on the screen as well, with which the committee was guided, and it was also in a way wishing that how the higher education can be promoted in India, and the focus was on the upper classes that way. And in a way we find that at a later point of time when Macaulay comes to India, and he is being given this kind of a command where he decides about the kind of education policy which was to be followed in India. He talks about how the Western education is to be introduced in India, and through the Governor General's resolution which was introduced in 1835 when William Bentinck was the Governor General of India. So these kind of changes they came, and the issue of the Orientalist and the Anglicist debate was settled with this kind of an idea when T.B. Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, he became the president of the Committee of the Public Instruction. And S.C. Ghosh, he has argued that how Macaulay was a pro-Anglicist, and he made some kind of a plea for spreading the Western education through the medium of English. So we find that this debate with regard to the Orientalist and the Anglicist was settled at that point of time, when Macaulay was at the helm of affairs, and through his minute on education, Macaulay was able to in a way talk about the importance of English, how he relegated the other languages in that context and gave some kind of a primacy to English. And when William Bentinck, who was a Governor General, the Governor General's resolution, it talked about the object or the importance of the British government in that way, that how Western European the European sciences, literatures, they should be introduced in India, and how the Indian languages, Sanskrit, Persian and Arabic, they were not to be given that kind of an importance which was in a way given to the Western languages. And we find that all these kinds of Macaulay's minute and the focus was on English learning, and Macaulay's minute was in a way, and his attitude was also reflective of the new appearance of imperialism, which now, instead of following the policy of neutrality, was constructed as a transcendental force with a grand burden of civilizing the natives. So we find that if we try to understand the Macaulay's minute and the approach of Macaulay, then it was also the approach of the imperialism of those times, and how imperialism was trying to present itself, how it was trying to position itself as some sort of a transcendental force, and they felt that it was the burden of the Europeans to civilize the native population. And this kind of a burden was later also talked about by Rudyard Kipling, when he talks about the white man's burden. And the idea of the white man's burden was there in the context that how the natives of Asia and Africa, they are barbaric, they are not civilized, and the light of the Western knowledge, the light of the Western sciences, the light of Christianity will vanish the kind of darkness in which the natives of these two continents, they were there, Asia and Africa. So British, they had this kind of an idea in their minds that they will be able to bring that kind of a change in the Indian society in terms of civilizing the society and bringing the light of Christianity. So these were the kinds of ideas which were there, and there were so many others, those who were talking about imperialism as some sort of a benevolent and political endeavor which was trying to bring out the less developed communities out of their the kind of stagnation in which they had gone into. So imperialism was in a way seen by Macaulay, Trevelyan, etc. as some sort of a benevolent political exercise, and they did not talk about the harmful effects of this kind of imperialism, which in a way reduced the native population, and how the native population was in a way reduced, how it was being subjugated, that was not looked into. And we talked about the idea of the messianic liability of the enlightened Europe to instill the modern values among the less civilized communities. So the less civilized communities of Europe and Asia, they were of Africa and Asia, they were to be civilized by the Europeans, and how the Europeans, they felt that the issue of the white man's burden, where they will civilize these barbaric people, and this was in a way promoted to give this kind of a picture to the native population, as if the British or the Europeans, they are there in India so as to help the Indians. And this kind of a thesis is also being promoted by so many scholars at later times, that how India and other colonies they benefited because of the colonial rule. But one has to understand that these kinds of developments which took place in these colonies, they would have definitely taken place in these colonies even if British and other colonialists would not have come to India and to other regions, because in terms of development there is a lot of borrowing between the different countries when they come into contact with each other. So we just cannot say the way British they exploited the Indians from the economic point of view, from the political, social, cultural point of view, and largely from the economic point of view we find that how the drain of wealth from India took place from India to Britain, and because of which we find that Indian society became comparatively decadent and backward. So when we see that how British they wanted to turn Indians into that how Indians they will only remain Indians in blood and color, but their taste, their opinion, their morals and intellect, all of it will change. So that was their idea, that when English education will be imparted to the Indians, then they will have this kind of a mindset, they will have this kind of a taste, their opinions will be such, and they will develop that kind of an intellect where they will be able to identify with the British in a far better way. So these kinds of ideas they were in a way being promoted, and when we talk about Macaulay and Macaulay's ideas, we find that he has also been criticized, that he had all these kinds of prejudices, he was in a way he was intolerant, and he did not even have that kind of a knowledge, because when he says that all the literatures of East are not worth a single shelf of a good European library. So in a way we find that how the ideas of Macaulay they had all sorts of prejudices towards the Orientalist or the Eastern societies, how the literatures of Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, how these were such rich literatures. So in a way Macaulay is arguing that these literatures were not all that rich in nature, and literature was not all that vast as well, and they could even come in a single shelf of a good European library. So this is the kind of mindset, this is the kind of prejudice or stereotyping which we find with Macaulay and so many others, those who felt that English was a comparatively much better language. But one has to understand that languages may be different, they may have some kind of origins, some languages may be older, some languages may be new, but they cannot be inferior and superior in nature, they may be different. Similarly, cultures are not inferior and superior, they are different in nature. So we will talk about it more in our next lecture. We will talk about the colonial education policy further and the kind of changes which came over a period of time, and how Indians they in a way also contributed to education in India. Thank you so much.